Welcome to the fourth episode of our series on people who changed the world. Our guest today is Leonardo da Vinci, the genius of the millennium, a magnificent figure whose name is known even by those who know nothing about him. Here's a question for you. How many fields can one person master at most? 1, 3, 5? These numbers aren't enough for him. He conducted revolutionary studies in so many fields that it's hard to believe, because he believed that nature's endless workings were part of a grand unity filled with marvelous patterns. And he was curious about all of them. His ability to merge the humanities with the fundamental sciences made Leonardo da Vinci the most creative polymath in history. His scientific research influenced his art, and his art influenced his scientific research. At his core, Leonardo considered himself a scientist and an engineer. With an often obsessive passion, he carried out groundbreaking work in architecture, anatomy, fossils, birds, machines, sculptures, optics, botany, geology, cartography, music, and weaponry. And of course, you may have heard, he could also paint. And how? The two most famous paintings in history came from his hand: The Last Supper and Mona Lisa. Leonardo had almost no formal education. He could barely read and write in Latin, the scientific language of the time, and struggled with long division. But he had an imagination so vivid it flirted with the limits of fantasy. He was incredibly curious. Over 7,200 pages of notes, sketches, and doodles, only a quarter of which survived by miracle, give us detailed insight into this imagination and extraordinary curiosity. Leonardo kept lists of things he needed to do and learn for years. He asked himself questions most of us wouldn't even think about in a lifetime. Why is the sky blue? Why are fish in the water more agile than birds in the air? Shouldn't it be the other way around, since water is heavier and denser than air? What does a woodpecker's tongue look like? These questions wouldn't necessarily help him paint or design flying machines, but he wanted to know because he was Leonardo, curious, passionate, and full of surprises. In this video, it's impossible to do full justice to all of his works and identities. That would take dozens of hours of content. Also, we know only a small fraction of Leonardo's works and notes have survived to this day. So let's examine the highlights of Leonardo's apprenticeship and mastery periods. Let's see how he became the most important representative of classicism in painting. And let's not only focus on his identity as an artist, but also touch upon his other personas. In this video, we'll explore many aspects of Leonardo, from military technologies to anatomical drawings, from cartography to geology, from the world's most famous painting to the lost Salvator Mundi discovered in 2006. You won't believe these works were created over 500 years ago. Let's begin. As always in the Holocene Biography Series, let's first go back to our hero's childhood. Let's see what kind of childhood the genius of the millennium had and what kind of family he came from. Leonardo was born out of wedlock, and that turned out to be lucky. Had he been born legitimate, he likely would have been expected to become a notary, just like the firstborn sons in his family for at least 5 generations. Notary work was a respectable profession, but Leonardo had something far greater within him. The word Vinci comes from the small town near Florence, where he was born. His name, Leonardo da Vinci, simply means Leonardo from Vinci. Florence, in 1452, the year he was born, was an independent republic. His father, Piero, moved to Vinci around 1451 when he was about 25 years old. The next year, he had a relationship with a peasant girl, and on April 15, 1452, they had a son. While we know quite a bit about Leonardo's paternal side, his mother wasn't even deemed worthy of mention in the birth or baptismal records, because this was a child born outside of marriage. In 2017, Newly uncovered records revealed that Leonardo's mother was a 16-year-old orphan named Caterina Lippi. She was poor and from a lower social class. Piero couldn't marry her, partly because of the class difference, but also because he was already engaged to the daughter of a wealthy shoemaker. He married that woman within 8 months of Leonardo's birth. In Renaissance Florence, being born out of wedlock wasn't fully taboo, but it wasn't entirely accepted either, especially among the middle class. Illegitimate children were sometimes accepted as part of the family, but also faced exclusion. Leonardo, for example, later encountered problems with inheritance and was denied entry to the notaries' guild to which his father belonged. But in a way, that may have been a blessing. Without those restrictions, Leonardo might never have become the Renaissance polymath we admire today. After his father's marriage, Caterina also married. From the age of 5, Leonardo mostly lived with his grandfather Antonio in the da Vinci family home. His uncle Francesco also played a fatherly role in raising him. Leonardo didn't receive a proper formal education. His early schooling took place in the fields, meadows, and forests surrounding the family farmhouse. His main teacher was his young uncle, Francesco. This philosophical and idle uncle passed on to his nephew a personal worldview centered around nature. His philosophy was made up of observations, evidence, verifications, and, above all, a love for all things created. He often took young Leonardo down to the river or the woods, showing him how insects underwent metamorphosis. When he reached school age, Leonardo attended what was known as an abacus school. Aside from learning some commercial mathematics there, he was essentially self-taught. He had so many interests that his attention would quickly drift. His never-ending questions and constant comments overwhelmed and baffled his teachers. While he was good at geometry, he struggled with basic algebra and equations, which were central to education at the time. He also never properly learned Latin. However, this lack of formal training turned him into someone obsessed with experience and experimentation. It made him a free thinker, not bound by convention. He avoided the rigid, dogmatic education of the Middle Ages that sought to enforce unquestioned truths. He didn't blindly respect authority and questioned conventional knowledge. On top of that, he had a strong desire and talent for observing nature's wonders. Leonardo trained himself to perceive forms and shadows with astonishing precision. From the beating of wings to the expressions on human faces, he had a particular gift for capturing motion. On this foundation, he designed experiments, some in his mind, some on paper, and a few with real objects. In many ways, it was a good time to be born for a child with such passions and talents. In 1452, the same year Leonardo was born, Johannes Gutenberg opened his printing press. That meant excellent books were becoming accessible to people like Leonardo, who lacked formal education. Italy was also entering a rare 40-year period of peace. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans triggered a flood of scholars and ancient manuscripts in Italy. With the rise of a status-driven merchant class eager to fund artists, Florence became the cradle of Renaissance art and humanism. The Renaissance, literally rebirth, a period when justice and republicanism were glorified, a movement of science and art that would trigger social, political, and economic changes and last for centuries. This was the era into which little Leonardo was born. Despite being born out of wedlock, Leonardo had a fairly stable life in Vinci until the age of 12. However, this stability changed in 1464. Leonardo's stepmother, Albiera, died during childbirth along with the baby. Not long before that, Leonardo's grandfather Antonio had also passed away. Feeling lonely, Leonardo's father decided to bring him to the center of Florence so that he could learn a profession. Leonardo didn't like the bustling city life at first, but over time he adapted and would go on to build a good life here, surrounded by students, friends, and patrons, people who supported and protected him. In the 1400s, there was no place more stimulating for creativity than Florence. It had a population of 40,000 and wasn't ruled by a hereditary monarchy. Its economy flourished through a blend of art, technology, design, chemistry, and commerce. Masters from all artistic disciplines were present here, and many of the city's artists were also architects. In such a city, newly wealthy families commissioned unique works of art, purchased luxurious silk garments and gold jewelry, built grand residences, and took artists and writers under their protection to solidify their social standing. Leonardo was drawn to activities like drawing and shaping objects. It was in Florence that he began to discover and understand himself. He was an extremely curious and observant child, so it would be fair to say he had come to the right place. He would go out alone, wandering through the workshops of artists and craftsmen, and whenever he saw a beautiful painting or a cleverly designed tool, he would rush over to study it. He also continued his investigations into the animal and plant kingdoms on his own, catching insects, fish, and birds in Florence's gardens, orchards, and riverbanks, collecting plants and flowers. To remember them and record their features permanently, he began to draw. Observing, taking notes, compiling lists, doodling, and sketching came naturally to him, but the contents of his notebooks resembled nothing the world had ever seen. They were perhaps the most astonishing expression of human observation and imagination ever put to paper. Because Leonardo wanted to understand not only how things worked, but also why they worked. In Florence, the government was in the hands of the extraordinarily wealthy banker Medici family, who dominated politics and culture. The Medici rose to become the wealthiest family on the continent by managing the fortunes of Europe's elite. In 1469, Lorenzo de' Medici, nicknamed Lorenzo the Magnificent by the people, became the ruler. One of his first actions was to take his grandfather's Platonic Academy under his patronage. Lorenzo was a man who preferred spending his wealth rather than hoarding it. He glorified art and supported innovative and creative artists. He also established a peaceful balance of power with rival city-states. He loved organizing dazzling shows and grand entertainments for his citizens. All of this fired the creativity and imagination of many artists, especially the young Leonardo, who worked behind the scenes preparing such events. Leonardo was known for his attractive appearance and was considered a handsome man throughout his life. He loved to dress well and was famous for his warm and kind manner toward both people and animals. He was friendly, a nature lover, and someone who valued wisdom over wealth, choosing to spend his time gaining knowledge rather than pursuing highly profitable work. He had a deep love for animals and respected their right to live. Horses were a particular favorite of his. He would buy birds from street vendors just to set them free. He spent most of his life as a vegetarian. He never married, and there's no definitive information about his sexual orientation. Leonardo was left-handed. He wrote from right to left, forming letters in a mirror image that an ordinary person could barely read without using a mirror. His left-handedness also influenced his drawing technique. He drew from right to left. Unlike most artists, his scanning lines typically moved from the lower right to the upper left. This distinctive approach makes it easier today to identify his drawings. During his apprenticeship, everything fascinated young Leonardo. He read everything he could find. His imagination deeply penetrated every subject he explored. He had a remarkable ability to combine observation with imagination, which would make him the greatest innovator-creator of all time. However, being self-taught also meant he worked without a structured method, sometimes repeating himself or wasting time on secondary or easily obtainable knowledge. When Leonardo was 14 years old, his father arranged an apprenticeship for him with a client of his, Andrea del Verrocchio, a versatile artist and engineer who ran one of the best workshops in Florence. Verrocchio didn't take Leonardo on just as a favor to his father. He was genuinely impressed by the boy's talent. In fact, he was astonished by how gifted he was. Verrocchio's workshop, located on a street near Piero's notary office, perfectly fits Leonardo. When Leonardo arrived, the studio was filled with craftsmen, and many works of art were being produced for the Medici family. But it was more commercially driven than a refined art studio. Verrocchio was a kind and generous master. Many of his students continued to work with him long after their apprenticeships ended. He had a strong interest in science, particularly geometry. His workshop followed a rigorous curriculum that included studies in surface anatomy, mechanics, drawing techniques, and the effects of light and shadow on materials such as draped fabric. The workshop's main discussion topics were mathematics, anatomy, dissection, classical antiquities, music, and philosophy. Leonardo's master was an exceptionally talented man whose brilliance was never fully recognized. His paintings and sculptures possessed dazzling beauty, especially the equestrian statue of Bartolomeo Colleoni, which is still regarded as a masterpiece today. While Leonardo had learned in Abacus school how mathematics could be used in commerce, it was from Verrocchio that he learned something far more valuable: the wonder of geometry. There was harmony in proportions. Mathematics, he realized, was nature's brushstroke. During his apprenticeship, Leonardo was greatly influenced by Leon Battista Alberti's book On Painting. Alberti believed that the movements of the soul could be revealed through the movements of the body. Leonardo adopted this approach and would later write, "A good painter should paint two main things: the human figure and the workings of the mind. The first is easy, the second is difficult, because it must be conveyed through gestures, facial expressions, and the movements of limbs. These gestures must reflect inner emotions." His father, Piero, recognized Leonardo's gift for blending art with the wonders of nature. In fact, he once profited from it. A peasant from Vinci crafted a small wooden shield and asked Piero to bring it to Florence to have it painted. Piero assigned the task to his son, who decided to paint a terrifying, fire-breathing monster on it. To give it a realistic appearance, Leonardo gathered parts from real lizards, snakes, and bats. When the painting was finished, it was so vivid and lifelike that when Piero came to collect the shield, he was startled by the monstrous figure staring back at him from the dim light. He had never seen anything so unique and extraordinary. Piero decided to keep the shield for himself and bought a different one for the peasant. That shield is now lost, its fate unknown. It was likely sold by his business-minded father for a high price and passed through many hands over the centuries. And what did Leonardo receive in return? His reward was the moment of fear and awe he saw in his father's face. That alone was enough for a true artist. Money didn't matter. And so, the story of what may have been Leonardo's first documented artwork began just like that. During this period, Leonardo learned to paint not only animals, but also objects. For example, his exercises in drawing draped fabrics helped him develop one of the essential components of his artistic genius: the ability to use light and shadow to create an effective illusion of three-dimensionality on a two-dimensional surface. Later in life, he would write the following in one of his notebooks: "The first aim of the painter is to show an object on a flat surface as if it were three-dimensional. He who does this with greater skill than anyone else is worthy of the highest praise." This superior ingenuity of the science of painting originates from light and shadow. While mastering drapery drawings in Verrocchio's workshop, Leonardo also pioneered the technique of sfumato, which involved softening outlines and blending edges. Rather than painting objects with sharp contours, after Leonardo, painters began using sfumato to depict them as they actually appear to the human eye. Leonardo's famous innovation leaves certain elements always to our imagination. In his own words, he described the sfumato technique as, "You should not outline light and shadow with sharp lines or hard edges. Instead, you should blend them like smoke vanishing into the air." Leonardo's most famous early drawing is a depiction of a fierce-faced Roman warrior, shown in profile, wearing an elaborate helmet. This work was created after the Duke of Milan visited Florence. It is drawn with a fine silver point on prepared paper, based on a drawing by Verrocchio himself. The drawing contains extremely intricate patterns, The warrior's helmet is decorated with an extremely realistic bird's wing and the curls and spirals that Leonardo was so fond of. Leonardo's observational skill fueled his imagination throughout his life. He would walk the streets with a notebook hanging from his belt. When he encountered people with exaggerated features or interesting faces that would make good models, he would invite them to dinner. While they ate, Leonardo would sit across from them and tell the most ridiculous stories, carefully observing every gesture and expression. Later, he would go to his room and transfer these observations to paper. This is how he honed his mastery. Leonardo's creations were not confined to paper sketches. He had a burning desire to become an architect and engineer. One example of this is his famous drawing of the aerial screw, often considered the first helicopter design. He theorized this spiral-shaped contraption made of linen, wire, and bamboo to lift off the ground by spinning. In his notes, he even included details such as the linen's pores are sealed with starch. However, there is no information on how the device would be operated by a human. It's possible the aerial screw was designed more as an entertaining prop for theatrical performances in Florence. Verrocchio's workshop had a collaborative and friendly environment. Leonardo enjoyed it so much that, even after his apprenticeship officially ended at age 20 in 1472, he continued working there for a while. He also registered with the Compagnia di San Luca, the Painters' Guild of Florence. In his early 20s, Leonardo contributed to 2 paintings at Verrocchio's workshop. In Tobias and the Angel, he painted the scampering dog and shimmering fish. In the Baptism of Christ, he painted the angel on the far left. One day, while Leonardo was working on the angel, it was lunchtime. His friend Lorenzo leaned his elbows on the table, resting his face in his hands, completely entranced, watching Leonardo paint. Next to Leonardo's angel was another angel that Verrocchio had drawn earlier. Naturally, Lorenzo compared the two and gently said, "Leonardo, do you know your angel is more beautiful than our master's?" Leonardo pretended not to hear. "I'm telling you this, but even he would admit it if he were here." While other students chased after fun and girls, Leonardo couldn't tear himself away from the angel. He meticulously refined the already flawless work, trying to make it even more perfect. His friend repeated, "Leonardo, I'm telling you, your angel is more beautiful than the master's." Leonardo was about to answer his friend when he saw his master Verrocchio at the door. He was looking at his young pupil's work with folded arms. He had arrived at such a moment that he heard Lorenzo's fervent comment. Now he was seeing with his own eyes how true this observation was. Verrocchio approached the painting and affectionately placed his hand on Leonardo's shoulder. He picked up the brush he had last used on that painting and, as if to show he was done with painting forever, broke it. He decided never to paint again, because the student had surpassed the master. When we compare the 2 angels in the painting, we understand why Verrocchio made this decision. While Verrocchio's angel has a stiff face and blank eyes, Leonardo's angel has a much more realistic expression. The pose has a dynamic twist, as seen in the body turning slightly left and the neck turning right. This shows us how Leonardo had already mastered depicting movement in art. Also, it's clear from this painting that his sfumato technique, the softening of sharp contours, had become a signature feature of his art. Aside from his collaborative works, Leonardo painted at least 4 paintings largely on his own during his 20s. Now, let's take a closer look at some of these. The first of them is The Annunciation. It depicts the moment when the Archangel Gabriel announces to the Virgin Mary that she will be the mother of Jesus, leaving her in shock. This scene was immensely popular during the Renaissance. In Leonardo's version, Mary lifts her head from a book she's been reading and looks at Gabriel. She's seated in the walled garden of a grand country villa. Though passionate in intent, the painting is full of imperfections, leading some scholars to believe it was a group effort by various painters in Verrocchio's workshop. However, Several clues suggest Leonardo was the principal artist. So what are the flaws? The bulky garden wall has a perspective error where the open section meets the corner. The folds in Mary's robe are stiff and unnatural. The armrest of the bench looks like a third knee. The cypress trees are oddly uniform in height, and Mary's posture and expression make her look like a shop window mannequin. The most jarring issue is the positioning of the lectern in front of Mary. It appears about a meter closer to the viewer, making her right arm look unnaturally long. While still an impressive work, it's clearly the product of a young artist. In later years, Leonardo would address these flaws through detailed studies in perspective and optics. It's also possible he was experimenting with a technique known as anamorphosis, where some elements appear distorted unless viewed from a specific angle. In short, this painting, with its playful spatial distortions, reflects the raw beginnings of a budding genius. Today, the Annunciation is housed in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, Italy. Now, let's move on to the Madonnas. Small religious paintings and sculptures of the Virgin Mary, with the infant Jesus, were standard commissions at Verrocchio's workshop. Leonardo is known to have painted at least two of these, the Munich Madonna and the Benoit Madonna. The most striking feature in both works is the plump, lively baby Jesus. His soft, chubby body demonstrates how far Leonardo had come in modeling light and shadow to create lifelike three-dimensional forms. He also applied the chiaroscuro technique, using black pigment to create sharp light-dark contrasts instead of simply darkening color tones. With the chiaroscuro technique, Leonardo succeeded for the first time in creating perfect three-dimensional forms in a painting that could rival the volumetric presence of sculpture. In the Benoit Madonna especially, we see Leonardo's skill at capturing emotion and interaction. The moment becomes more than just a frozen scene. It turns into a living story. The Munich Madonna, as the name suggests, is housed in the Alte Pinakothek Art Museum in Munich, Germany. The Benoit Madonna is exhibited in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. Leonardo's first non-religious painting features a melancholy young woman with luminous skin, posed before a backdrop of spiky juniper leaves. At first glance, it might seem a bit dull, but Ginevra de' Benci contains many hallmarks of Leonardo's emerging style: glowing, curly hair, and a strikingly modern three-quarter view. Ginevra was the daughter of a prominent Florentine banker. In early 1474, at age 16, she married Luigi Niccolini, a 32-year-old widower. In his 1480 tax return, Luigi noted that his wife was ill and undergoing long-term treatment. Leonardo portrayed her under soft lighting with a pale, almost ethereal expression. Her blank, distant stare seems to hint at something deeper than physical illness, perhaps emotional or mental anguish. Her eyes are the most compelling part of the painting. They're meticulously rendered to create a convincing three-dimensional effect. The eyelids enhance her melancholic mood. Another noteworthy detail is the glassy sheen Leonardo achieved with oil paint. Just beside the pupils of both eyes, there's a tiny sparkle of light, representing sunlight from the right. We see the same shimmer in her curls. This perfect highlight would become one of Leonardo's trademarks. It's something we see every day but rarely stop to consider. In this painting, Leonardo created a psychological portrait that revealed hidden emotions. This would later become one of his most important artistic innovations. The portrait set him on a path that, nearly 30 years later, would reach its peak in the most iconic psychological portrait in history, the Mona Lisa. Today, Ginevra de' Benci is displayed at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Of course, it's no Mona Lisa, not even close, but it was clearly painted by the hand that would one day create her. In 1477, Leonardo finally left Verrocchio's studio and opened his own workshop. But commercially, this move was a total failure. In the 5 years before his departure to Milan, he received only 3 known commissions. He never started one of them, and he left the other 2 unfinished. Still, even those incomplete paintings were enough to gain him a solid reputation and influence the art world. One of them is the Adoration of the Magi, now housed at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. Though never completed, this painting is considered one of the most influential unfinished works in art history. It was also the most revolutionary and anti-classical painting of the 15th century, a dazzling display of genius. The commission was placed in March 1481, when Leonardo was 29, by the monks of the San Donato Monastery just outside Florence's city walls. The painting was supposed to be completed in no more than 30 months. However, due to a poorly written contract, the project was soon abandoned. Payments stopped just 7 months after work began, and Leonardo walked away from the job. As a result, one of the most creative artists in history found himself carving clock decorations for firewood, borrowing money for paint, and begging for wine. Let's take a closer look at this fascinating composition. At the center of the painting, Leonardo placed the Virgin Mary and the infant Jesus. The baby reaches out his hand, and from this moment, the story spirals outward in a clockwise motion. As the viewer's eyes follow this swirling vortex, the scene becomes more than a historical moment. It transforms into a dramatic narrative. Jesus is receiving a gift from one of the Magi. Another king, having already presented his gift, bows his head in reverence. On the far right, we even see a self-portrait of Leonardo. Depicting a crowd of characters, each in motion and with distinct emotional expressions, was a daunting task. Each figure needed a unique pose and psychological state. The result is a whirlwind of emotion and drama. By vividly portraying the reactions of those seeing baby Jesus for the first time, Leonardo drew the viewer into the scene's emotional intensity. Leonardo would leave this and many other works unfinished. His perfectionism made these projects unbearably exhausting. His ideas were so intricate and brilliant that realizing them without flaw became impossible, and this would paralyze him. His hand couldn't always keep up with the images in his mind. His standards were so high that he saw flaws in works others considered miracles, which led him to abandon many of his projects. In fact, Leonardo's philosophy of art could be summed up as, "Art is never finished, only abandoned." Another unfinished painting is Saint Jerome, now displayed in the Vatican museums. This piece clearly reveals Leonardo's desire to link the motions of the body with the emotions of the soul. The unfinished work shows Saint Jerome, the 4th century scholar who translated the Bible into Latin, in the desert during his time of solitude. Emaciated and weary, the saint appears to be pleading with God for forgiveness. Yet at the same time, he seems overwhelmed by a sense of shame. All of Leonardo's paintings are psychological in nature. Without exception, they express his deep desire to portray emotion. But this desire is at its most intense in Saint Jerome. This painting also marks his first anatomical study. In Leonardo's view, a painter had to understand the anatomy of nerves, bones, muscles, and tendons. He conducted dissections on cadavers to study and record his discoveries. Saint Jerome received its final updates about 20 years after its initial sketches. As I mentioned earlier, Leonardo didn't like declaring any work finished. With every new piece of knowledge, he would revise his paintings. That's why he kept many of them in his possession for years, continually adding subtle touches. By the time he approached the age of 30, Leonardo was feeling increasingly lost. Meanwhile, his contemporaries were achieving great success. For example, Botticelli, his peer, had become the Medici family's favorite artist by consistently delivering finished masterpieces. None of this diminished Leonardo's brilliance, but the truth was he had very little to show for it. His known artistic achievements consisted of remarkable yet secondary contributions to 2 paintings by Verrocchio, a few depictions of the Madonna produced in the workshop and difficult to distinguish from others, a portrait of a young woman that he never delivered, and 2 unfinished drafts of masterpieces. It was time for Leonardo, who was slowly running out of steam, to hit the road. In 1482, at the age of 30, Leonardo da Vinci left Florence and set out for Milan, where he would spend the next 17 years of his life. He was accompanied by a young companion, a promising 15-year-old musician named Atalante Migliorotti. Migliorotti had learned to play the lyre from Leonardo and would go on to become one of the many young men who moved in and out of Leonardo's inner circle over the years. According to Leonardo's calculations in his notebooks, the distance between Florence and Milan was 290 kilometers, and he estimated the journey would take about a week. That was a remarkably accurate prediction. He had even developed a kind of odometer that counted the revolutions of a wheel, and he may have tested it on this very trip. Assuming he might settle in Milan, Leonardo brought nearly all of his possessions with him, including a number of paintings, designs for ovens, and drawings of maritime and hydraulic machines. This tells us that even back then, he was just as deeply interested in engineering as he was in art. With a population of 125,000, Milan was 3 times the size of Florence. But unlike Florence, it was not a merchant republic. It was a militarized city-state ruled by self-declared dukes. In Renaissance Europe, rulers competed not only in military might, but also in cultural achievements. The court of Milan offered Leonardo a perfect opportunity, a place where he could find both prestige and a regular salary. When Leonardo arrived, Milan was under the rule of Ludovico Sforza. Ruthless and pragmatic, Ludovico hid his cruelty behind the polished image of a refined and cultured statesman. He engaged in painting and literature, surrounding himself with prominent scholars and artists. In doing so, he was solidifying both his own reputation and that of Milan on a firm and respectable foundation. Unlike Florence, Milan wasn't full of established artists. That made it fertile ground for Leonardo, who stood out as a unique talent. Wanting to gain Ludovico's patronage, he wrote him a carefully crafted letter. In this carefully considered letter, Leonardo emphasized not his artistic identity, but rather his claimed expertise in military engineering. He did so because he understood that the Sforza dynasty, having seized power by force, was constantly under threat from internal uprisings or a French invasion. This was a way to capture Ludovico's interest. In truth, the things Leonardo claimed he could do were the things he wanted to do. He had never taken part in a war, nor had he ever produced weapons. Everything he described in the letter existed only in the design stage. But once he settled in Milan, he would begin to pursue his passion for military engineering with genuine seriousness. During his time in Florence, Leonardo had sketched some cleverly designed war machines. One of them was a mechanism intended to knock down the ladders of enemy soldiers attempting to scale castle walls. Defenders inside the fortress would pull long levers connected to rods that extended through holes in the wall. A similar idea involved a propeller-like device designed to slash at enemies who had managed to reach the top of the wall. The spread of the printing press helped Leonardo, after arriving in Milan, to study existing designs and develop new ideas for war machines. For some of his concepts, he drew upon the works of renowned scientists and engineers of his time. One of these concepts was the terrifying scythed chariot. With deadly rotating knives extending from its wheels and 4-bladed spinning axles that could be attached to the front and back, it was a true machine of death. But Leonardo's drawing did more than just depict a weapon. It was also a stunning work of art. Galloping horses, cloaked riders, and dismembered enemies were all rendered with a level of shading and modeling worthy of display in a museum. Another imagined but never realized weapon was the massive crossbow that Leonardo designed in Milan. He created over 30 drawings of it, meticulously detailing the gears, screws, axles, triggers, and other mechanisms. We can grasp the sheer scale of this gigantic machine, 24 meters in length, by comparing it to the soldier drawn beside it. With this crossbow, Leonardo attempted to calculate the correlation between the distance the bowstring was drawn and the force applied to the launched projectile. After running various calculations, he concluded that the force would be proportional to the angle at which the string was pulled. However, it would later become clear that this wasn't entirely accurate. Leonardo did not know trigonometry, so he wasn't able to refine his theory. Still, in terms of conceptual thinking, he had come remarkably close to being right. Leonardo also sketched many other machines and weapons, turtle-shaped tanks, steam-powered cannons, and more. However, as far as we know, only one of his military ideas was ever used in actual combat: the wheel lock, designed in the 1490s. The wheel lock was a method of igniting gunpowder by generating a spark. When the trigger was pulled, a spring turned a metal wheel. As the wheel spun against a piece of stone, it created enough friction to produce a spark and fire the gunpowder charge. The wheel lock would eventually become widespread, both in warfare and in personal use. Duke Sforza never fully appreciated Leonardo's brilliance. Just like his military pursuits, Leonardo's architectural efforts largely remained as creative ideas that were never put into practice. In 1487, he presented a radical city concept through countless pages of writings and drawings. In this vision, he likened plague-ridden cities to living, breathing organisms. His imagined utopian city had two layers. The upper level would be entirely focused on beauty, open only to pedestrians, while the lower, hidden level would contain canals, sanitation systems, and waste management infrastructure. Had Leonardo's forward-thinking designs been even partially realized, they could have improved the structure of cities, mitigated the devastation caused by plagues, and perhaps even changed the course of history. But their importance went unrecognized. Ultimately, Leonardo joined Ludovico Sforza's court not as an architect or engineer, but as an impresario, a producer of courtly spectacles. These events required a blend of both artistic and technical elements, all of which fell within Leonardo's wide range of interests: stage design, costumes, scenery, music, mechanical setups, choreography, allegorical storytelling, automata, and ingenious devices. From today's perspective, one might think that the time spent on such spectacles could have been used for more productive endeavors. But in those days, the performances staged at the Sforza court were seen as highly significant. Through their use of historical and religious imagery, these events served to legitimize the rule of the Sforza dynasty. As a result, their creators were held in high esteem. At times, these entertainments even transformed into intellectual festivals, educational events in their own right. They featured scientific demonstrations, debates on the superiority of different art forms, and exhibitions of ingenious devices. In many ways, they were early examples of the idea of bringing science to the public, a concept that would later gain popularity during the Enlightenment. At the heart of these visually and sonically rich celebrations was an extravagant production called The Heavens. The highlight of the show was a performance titled The Dance of the Planets. Leonardo achieved great success with the production of The Heavens. It brought him more fame than he had ever earned as a painter, and far more than he could have ever dreamed of gaining as a military engineer. What's more, he truly enjoyed this work. It was as if he had been born to create fantastical choreographies, born from the union of imagination and mechanical ingenuity. Designing clever contraptions that lifted and lowered performers, made them fly through the air, and created dazzling visual effects that left audiences breathless was a source of immense pleasure for him. These productions were also a lucrative source of income for him. Leonardo was also involved with music during his time at court. While his notebooks contain no musical compositions, they are filled with original and fantastical instrument designs. Instead of writing lyrics or playing sheet music, he would often improvise during performances at the Sforza court. He had even developed his own unique instrument, a type of lyre held like a violin. It had 5 strings meant to be played with a bow and 2 strings designed to be plucked with the fingers. Accompanied by this instrument, he would sing exquisite songs that filled the princes with what was described as miraculous delight. Leonardo's notebooks contain numerous studies of the male body. The most famous of these is the Vitruvian Man, considered one of the most iconic images of all time. Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, born around 80 BCE, was an engineer who served under Julius Caesar in the Roman army. He later became an architect and worked on a temple in the town of Fano, Italy. His most important legacy was a written work, De Architectura, on architecture, the only surviving architectural treatise from classical antiquity. Vitruvius's work had been forgotten throughout the dark centuries, but it was rediscovered and compiled in the early 1400s. Eventually, in the late 1480s, a Latin edition was printed by one of the newly established presses in Italy. Leonardo even made a note to himself in his notebook: "Go to the bookseller and ask for Vitruvius." What made Vitruvius's treatise so appealing to Leonardo was its emphasis on the relationship between the human microcosm and the world as a macrocosm. This analogy deeply resonated with Leonardo in both his art and his science. Around that time, he famously wrote, "The ancients referred to man as a microcosm. This expression is quite accurate, for the human body resembles the world." Vitruvius applied this analogy to the design of temples, writing in the introduction to his third book, "The design of a temple is based on symmetry. Just as in a well-formed human body, there must be a harmonious relationship among its components." These ideas inspired Leonardo, and as part of his anatomical studies, which began in 1489, he set out to compile a similar series of measurements. This led to Leonardo's own version of the Vitruvian Man. The Vitruvian Man may actually be a self-portrait of Leonardo without a beard. He was 38 years old when he drew it, and the image aligns with descriptions of him from that period. There are two key features that distinguish his version from others drawn around the same time. In terms of both scientific precision and artistic mastery, Leonardo's work stands on an entirely different level. Unlike rough sketches, the lines are not tentative. Leonardo etched them onto the page with the confident hand of someone creating an engraving. Before starting the drawing, Leonardo is believed to have precisely determined how the circle would rest on the base of the square, and how it would extend beyond it in both width and height. Using a compass and a straight edge, he drew the circle and square, then positioned the man's feet accordingly. As in Vitruvius's description, the man's navel ended up at the exact center of the circle, and his genitals at the center of the square. Another important detail is the accompanying notes on the page, filled with meticulous measurements and observations about human anatomy and body proportions. Today, to prevent fading from prolonged exposure to light, the drawing is rarely displayed. It is kept in a locked room at the Accademia Gallery in Venice. In the spring of 1489, Leonardo was commissioned to create a massive bronze equestrian statue in honor of the Ludovico Sforza dynasty. Since Ludovico's power did not stem from a long-established noble lineage, he needed monumental symbols to glorify his family name and solidify his authority. Leonardo's design for the horse and rider was intended to fulfill exactly that purpose. The statue, planned to stand 7 meters tall and weigh 75 tons, would be cast entirely in bronze, making it the largest sculpture of its kind ever attempted at the time. During the preparation phase, Leonardo immersed himself in a detailed study of horse anatomy, conducting meticulous measurements and dissections. He recorded his findings in his notebooks, producing numerous diagrams, charts, and sketches. Eventually, in November 1493, he succeeded in creating a full-scale clay model, which was unveiled during a celebratory event. The colossal and magnificent model was so impressive that it earned praise from court poets. Leonardo was now on the verge of gaining fame not only as a painter but also as a sculptor and engineer. But first, the statue had to be completed. Even before the clay model was finished, Leonardo had already begun working on the casting process for the grand statue. With great precision and skill, he spent more than 2 years refining his design plans. To determine the ideal materials and mixtures for the casting, he conducted experiments with different substances and combinations. Traditionally, large statues were cast in separate pieces. Leonardo's sculpture was so massive that this method seemed inevitable. But this was Leonardo, and his obsession with perfection emerged once again. He decided to cast the statue in a single piece. One page from his notebook contains fascinating drawings of the various apparatuses required for the task. He then designed an iron framework with a gridded structure, like a corset, to wrap around the mold from the outside and prevent it from breaking or losing its shape. Even this supporting cage could be considered a work of art in its own right. Everything was nearly ready. The greatest and most magnificent statue in history was close to completion when the project was abruptly halted. Military expenses had taken precedence over artistic ones. When the King of France invaded Italy, Ludovico decided that the bronze intended for the statue would instead be used to make 3 cannons. And so, yet another great work of art was consigned to the realm of Leonardo's unfulfilled dreams. Throughout his life, Leonardo favored practice over theory until his 40s, when that mindset began to shift. He made great efforts to learn Latin, but never quite mastered it. When he visited Venice in 1500, the city had nearly 100 printing presses, and more than 200 million books had already been printed. Thanks to Gutenberg's printing technology, which had crossed the Alps into Italy, Leonardo was able to broaden his intellectual horizons. As a result, he became the first major European thinker to develop deep scientific knowledge without receiving a formal education in Latin or Greek. By 1492, Leonardo owned nearly 40 books. He had access to a wide variety of sources, including military machines, painting, architecture, agriculture, music, surgery, health, Aristotelian science, and the works of Arab physicists. In 1504, another 70 titles were added to his collection, bringing his library to a total of 40 scientific works, around 50 volumes of poetry and literature, 10 on art and architecture, 8 on religion, and 3 on mathematics. Thus, the old Leonardo was replaced by a new one, eager to gather knowledge from books. He finally realized that combining theory and experimentation was far more fruitful. Leonardo was a thinker far ahead of his time. His insistence on repeating and varying experiments to ensure the reliability of results foreshadowed the scientific method. As a result, he became one of the Western thinkers who laid the groundwork for the scientific revolution. For more than 20 years, Leonardo studied the flight of birds with remarkable dedication and worked on machines that could allow humans to fly. He produced over 500 sketches across various notebooks and wrote over 35,000 words on the subject. He explored patterns in nature and drew analogies from them. Many of these designs were eventually used in theatrical performances for stage effects. His mind was constantly occupied with things that wouldn't even occur to most of us. He analyzed whether birds flapped their wings at the same speed when moving up and down. In his notebooks, he would write out commands that determined how to methodically organize his observations step by step. As a result of one particularly important observation, which contributed to his studies on both flight and fluid dynamics, he made the following striking discoveries. Water cannot be compressed, but air can. As birds flap their wings, they push air downward and compress it into a smaller space. This increases the air pressure beneath the wing compared to the pressure above it. If air could not be compressed, birds would not be able to stay aloft by flapping their wings. The downward flap of a wing pushes the bird upward and forward. The amount of pressure the wing applies to the air is equally matched by the pressure the air applies back to the wing. Do you know what this is? It's the third law of motion that Newton would rediscover and formalize 200 years later. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. But Leonardo didn't stop there. With even greater foresight, he pointed to a principle that wouldn't become known until more than 2 centuries later, the Bernoulli principle. He observed that as the speed of air, or any fluid, increases, the pressure it exerts decreases. He even drew a cross-section of a bird's wing, showing that the top surface is more curved than the bottom. This helped him understand that birds are able to stay aloft because the faster airflow over the curved top of the wing creates lower pressure. For his time, this was an absolutely astonishing insight, but it would be buried within Leonardo's unpublished and complex notebooks, left undiscovered for centuries. Leonardo's mechanical designs weren't limited to flying machines. He produced hundreds of pages of sketches and notes for a wide range of inventions, including cranes, spiral gears, needle-sharpening devices for the textile industry, perpetual motion machines with screw turbines, and various types of levers. To illustrate how motion was transferred from gears and levers to wheels and pulleys, he often broke his machines down into components using cross-sectional views. His intuition also made him a forerunner of Newton's first law of motion, which would be formally defined 200 years later. He understood the concept of force, what he called impetus, as something that, when applied to a body, gives it acceleration. He wrote, "A body in motion seeks to continue moving in the same manner, but all the factors that slow it down must be removed." An instrument we now know as the tribometer, used to measure friction, wear, and lubrication between surfaces, was first designed by Leonardo. However, it wouldn't be rediscovered until the 18th century. He also noticed that lubricating an inclined surface reduced friction, making him one of the earliest engineers to add lubrication points to mechanical devices. He went on to design bearings and roller supports, and he recorded the best metal combinations to minimize friction. For example, he wrote that 3 parts copper should be melted with 7 parts tin, a formula that resulted in an ideal anti-friction alloy, one that wouldn't be rediscovered until 1839. Through his work on machines, Leonardo developed a mechanistic view of the world, one that foreshadowed Newton's vision. He came to the conclusion that all motion in the universe followed the same set of laws. As Europe entered a new scientific era, Leonardo, having embraced the identity of a scientist, openly mocked astrologers, alchemists, and those who believed in miracles. According to Leonardo, a painter had to be a good anatomist. When drawing a human figure, he would start with the bones, then add the muscles, followed by the skin. Only after that would he wrap the figure in fabric. He also studied how psychological emotions were reflected in physical movements and was deeply curious about how the nervous system functioned. In Milan, he took lessons from anatomy experts, studied medical texts, and learned to perform dissections. That is, he examined the structure of muscles, bones, and blood vessels by cutting open the bodies of dead humans and animals. He measured body proportions and created numerous anatomical drawings. He also understood that the human brain processes stimuli received through the senses and sends responses to the muscles via the nervous system. He used to write down many of the questions that preoccupied his mind. For example, which nerve causes the eye to move? Which tendon enables the movement of the thigh? How does human life begin in the womb? Leonardo didn't just measure every part of the body from every angle. He also studied how the movement of one joint triggered a chain reaction throughout the rest of the body. To explore this, he would have his assistants and models move, turn, squat, sit, and lie down in his workshop. In short, Leonardo's curiosity about anatomy was boundless, and this passion would inevitably find its way into his art. During the 10 years following Leonardo's arrival in Milan in 1482, the work he undertook primarily involved stage productions, sculptural efforts for the unfinished equestrian monument, and consulting on church designs. However, as would remain true until the final days of his life, his true talent was always painting. Now, let's continue our journey toward Leonardo's masterpieces. Up next, the Virgin of the Rocks paintings. Leonardo began work on the first version in the 1480s, but it was sold off due to a payment dispute with the commissioning confraternity. Today, this version resides in the Louvre Museum in Paris. The second version was begun in the 1490s and is now housed in the National Gallery in London. As you can tell from the cities where they are located, the first is known as the Paris version. while the second is referred to as the London version. Let's begin with the Paris version. In this painting, a curly-haired, androgynous-looking angel stands with an enigmatic presence, gazing directly out of the scene. By pointing to the child John the Baptist, the angel initiates the story, guiding the viewer's gaze. John is shown kneeling before the infant Jesus, hands clasped in reverence. The infant Jesus responds to this gesture with a sign of blessing. Mary, her body subtly twisting in motion, looks toward John and protectively clasps his shoulder. Her other hand hovers above Jesus' head. Taken together, these gestures form a kind of visual symphony, a preview of the expressive hand choreography seen in Leonardo's later masterpiece, The Last Supper. The angel's pointing finger is one of the main elements that distinguishes the first version from the second. Thanks to modern imaging techniques, we know Leonardo deliberated for a long time about whether to include this hand gesture. It is believed he decided to add it later during the development of the first version. In the second version, however, he completely omitted it, possibly because he felt it disrupted the visual connection between Mary's raised hand and the child's head. The narrative flow is reinforced by areas of illumination that give the painting a strong sense of unity. With this masterpiece, Leonardo essentially opens the door to a new artistic era, in which light and shadow work together to create a powerful sense of motion and cohesion. This first version of the Virgin of the Rocks also reveals a great deal about Leonardo's scientific knowledge, and how he applied that knowledge to his art. After all, the subject of the painting is both Mary and the rocks. The cave elements are rendered with astonishing geological accuracy. Most formations resemble weathered sandstone, a sedimentary rock. The plants depicted are also botanically and seasonally correct. The fact that Leonardo could envision something both highly imaginative and rigorously realistic tells us one thing very clearly. Leonardo had a deep interest in geology, and he understood the discipline remarkably well. Now, let's take a look at the London version. When we examine this painting, we see that it is almost identical to the first version of the Virgin of the Rocks, except that the angel is no longer pointing to John the Baptist. This time, the angel also doesn't look out toward the viewer. Instead, their dreamy gaze is absorbed in the scene. As a result, the narrative doesn't distract our attention. The Virgin Mary becomes the sole focal point, with her gestures and emotions taking center stage. In the London version, the modeling and three-dimensionality of the figures are significantly richer. Still, Leonardo may have delegated parts of the work to his assistants, as the plants and geological elements aren't rendered as realistically as in the first version. The rocks appear synthetic, lacking natural authenticity. Nevertheless, it's still safe to say that the painting is largely the work of Leonardo himself. For example, the characteristic radiant curls of the figures unmistakably bear his hand. The angel's sheer, delicately painted garment is another masterpiece, showcasing Leonardo's mastery in applying fine layers of oil paint. The sunlight falling on the fabric is captured with breathtaking precision. Now we take a step further, and I invite you to discover Leonardo's Milanese portraits. Let's begin with The Lady with an Ermine. The subject of the painting, Cecilia Gallerani, was a strikingly beautiful young woman from a well-educated middle-class family in Milan. Ludovico Sforza, the de facto Duke of Milan, was deeply captivated by both her intelligence and beauty. Around 1489, during the height of their passionate relationship, he commissioned Leonardo to paint a portrait of Cecilia, who was just 15 years old at the time. This would be Leonardo's first portrait commission since arriving in Milan 7 years earlier, and the result would be a stunning and groundbreaking masterpiece. Now known as Lady with an Ermine, the painting, done in oil on a walnut panel, is so innovative, emotionally charged, and lifelike that it played a key role in transforming the art of portraiture. It is considered the first truly modern portrait. It was the first European painting to suggest that a sitter's inner world could be captured through pose and gesture. Leonardo also broke with tradition by painting Cecilia in a three-quarter profile rather than the conventional full profile. Cecilia's body faces to our left, while her head appears to have turned swiftly to the right, as if reacting to something that has caught her attention. That something is likely Ludovico himself, coming from the direction of the light. In her arms, the white ermine, a symbol of purity and virtue, also perks up, as if alert to the same presence. Unlike the blank or distant gazes seen in other portraits of the period, including Leonardo's Ginevra de' Benci, this composition is full of life and immediacy. There is movement and tension. Leonardo captured a fleeting moment in Cecilia's inner and outer world. He paid meticulous attention to every detail, from the knuckles of her hand to her braided hair beneath a fine veil. The soft lighting on Cecilia's skin and the carefully rendered shadows enhanced the realism. Even the subtle light reflected from various surfaces, separate from the main light source, has been masterfully integrated. This is a prime example of how Leonardo's scientific understanding of optics enriched the three-dimensional illusion in his painting. Today, Lady with an Ermine is housed in the Czartoryski Museum in Krakow, Poland. It remains one of Leonardo da Vinci's greatest masterpieces, perhaps the most enchanting painting he ever created, second only to Mona Lisa. The subject of this portrait, known as La Belle Ferronnière, is most likely Lucrezia Crivelli, who replaced Cecilia as Ludovico's official mistress. Like Cecilia, Lucrezia also gave Ludovico a son. In return, Ludovico rewarded her by commissioning Leonardo to paint her portrait. In this painting, Leonardo masterfully employed reflected light that is independent of the primary light source I mentioned earlier. This is most evident just beneath Lucrezia's left cheek. The genius of the millennium was conducting scientific studies on how light changes depending on the angle at which it strikes a sloped surface. He filled his notebooks with meticulous measurements and annotated diagrams. Until then, no painter had managed to create such a perfect three-dimensional illusion of the human face through the use of light and shadow as Leonardo did. In particular, the flow and light-catching quality of the bows on Lucrezia's shoulders are magnificent. The embroidery is rendered with great precision. However, unlike Lady with an Ermine or Mona Lisa, this painting lacks that signature pose we often see in Leonardo's work. Though her head is turned, her body remains static, devoid of Leonardo's characteristic subtle twist. If you'd like to take a closer look, you can visit her at the Louvre Museum in Paris with the Mona Lisa. With these two portraits, it was becoming clear that Leonardo was rapidly rising to superstar status in the world of painting. He was turning into a living legend. The path was now paved for works like The Last Supper and Mona Lisa. Leonardo considered painting to be superior to sculpture, music, and poetry. In Renaissance Italy, intellectual debates comparing the merits of different disciplines were quite common. In such debates, Leonardo argued that painting was not only an art, but also a science. According to him, a painter's foremost task was to depict objects on a flat surface as if they were three-dimensional. This superior capability of painting came from the use of light and shadow. To achieve this, the artist had to master the principles of perspective and optics, fields that were rooted in mathematics. These disciplines had been explored in depth before. Since the time of the Arab mathematician Ibn al-Haytham, books have been written on the science of optics and perspective, and Leonardo's artistic predecessors built upon them. Painting was superior because the sense of sight was the noblest of all the senses. Moreover, it required not only intellect, but also imagination. It enabled the artist to create far more than just the real landscapes, objects, or creatures that already existed. At the time, most artists followed Alberti's path, placing emphasis on the primacy of contour lines. But Leonardo believed shadows were more important. In fact, it was his masterful use of shadows that distinguished his paintings from those of his contemporaries. In nature, there were no absolute and visible outer boundaries of objects. There was an infinite variation between light and dark. Leonardo was the pioneer of the sfumato technique, which relied on subtle and indistinct contours. He also used this technique as an analogy between the known and the mysterious. It was this radical insight, born from both observation and mathematics, that made Leonardo's art so unique. During his early days in Florence, while preparing his Adoration of the Magi, Leonardo struggled quite a bit with the mathematics of perspective. His greatest contribution to the study of perspective was not merely altering the relative sizes of objects, but rather introducing depth by varying color and clarity. In a painting, objects that recede into the distance should not only appear smaller but should also shift in color and become more blurred due to atmospheric and lighting effects. And that still wasn't enough. As the object recedes, its sharpness should also fade. At the farthest distances, even the outlines of forms should become indistinct. To be a master and a pioneer requires this. To introduce a new method, one had to combine observation, experimentation, theory, and experience. That was one of the key elements that made Leonardo the genius of the millennium. Now, let's take a look at one of the most famous paintings ever created by the genius of the millennium, The Last Supper. This was not an oil painting on canvas. It was a wall painting, in other words, a fresco. Ludovico wanted to build a sacred mausoleum for himself and his family. For that purpose, he rebuilt a small yet elegant church in the center of Milan, Santa Maria delle Grazie. Inside the monastery, he commissioned one of the most iconic religious scenes in art history, the Last Supper. In Renaissance Italy, just like scientific debates, artistic creation would sometimes turn into a public spectacle. While Leonardo was painting the Last Supper, people would come to watch him work, quietly sitting in a corner and observing. Leonardo would usually arrive early in the morning to paint, climb up the scaffolding, and work on the painting non-stop from sunrise to sunset, forgetting to eat or drink. But sometimes, after just a few brush strokes, he would stop and spend the whole day doing nothing, because he knew that creativity and inspiration weren't always at his command. Even though Ludovico was growing impatient, he knew better than to interfere too much with the artist's process. His patience paid off, and the result was one of the most captivating and expressive paintings in history, a masterpiece that showcased the full range of Leonardo's genius. The composition, crafted with remarkably clever techniques, was a brilliant fusion of natural and artificial perspectives. We'll get to those tricks of artificial perspective in a moment, but first, I'd like to tell you about the subject and the figures in the painting. In The Last Supper, Leonardo captured the very moment after Jesus told his disciples, "One of you will betray me." Each figure's reaction is part of a broader sequence, an instant caught between what has just happened and what is about to unfold. In each apostle, we see Leonardo's renowned ability to make emotions visible through physical gestures. This was one of the hallmarks of his art. He didn't just freeze a single moment. He staged a dramatic choreography, almost as if composing a scene for the theater. The drama begins just after Jesus has finished speaking. Now silent, he lowers his head, but his words spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped into water. This creates a vivid sense of storytelling. While the three apostles on the far left are still processing their initial reactions, the others have already started to respond or question one another. As Jesus' words echo through the room, the following moments, recorded in the Gospel, become part of the unfolding drama. The next verse in the Gospel of Matthew reads, "They were very sad, and began to say to him one after the other, 'Surely you don't mean me, Lord?'" According to Leonardo, When viewers look at the painting, they should be able to understand what is going through the figures' minds by observing their gestures and facial expressions. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the Last Supper stands as one of the most magnificent and vivid examples of this in the history of art. The dark-skinned, unattractive, and aquiline-nosed man you see fifth from the left is Judas, who realizes that the statement refers to him. In his right hand, he is holding the pouch filled with silver that was given to him in exchange for betraying Jesus. He is leaning backward and has knocked over a salt cellar. Unfortunately, these details are no longer very clear due to the painting's deterioration over the centuries. Now, let's return to the matter of perspective. The vanishing point is the only element of the painting's perspective that is free of illusion. These receding lines all converge toward Jesus' forehead. When Leonardo began working on the piece, he hammered a small nail into the center of the wall. Then, he carved thin grooves radiating outward across the wall from that point. To understand how Leonardo manipulated perspective masterfully, I want you to take another look at the tapestries hanging on the walls. You might think that the top edges of the wall tapestries appear to rise outward as if stretching toward the sky. But if you place a pencil and look closely, as I showed earlier, you'll notice that the lines lead directly to Jesus' forehead, which is the vanishing point. What's more, Leonardo painted them to align perfectly with the actual tapestries in the real dining hall, creating the illusion that the painting was an extension of the room itself. Because of the painting's large scale, Leonardo also used artificial perspective. That's because a viewer could see the painting not only from the front or the side, but also while walking past it. This required what Leonardo called a complex perspective, a combination of natural and artificial perspectives. For a painting of this size, the viewer's eye would never be equidistant from all surface edges, and Leonardo understood this very well. This accelerated perspective, where the walls and ceiling converge toward the vanishing point sooner than usual, was just one of many tricks Leonardo had learned from the theatrical productions he helped stage. In Renaissance productions, the stage was not a typical rectangular space, but rather one that was rapidly narrowed and shortened to create a stronger illusion of depth. It was tilted toward the audience, and the artificiality of the stage set was concealed by a decorated proscenium arch, just like the one Leonardo painted in The Last Supper. His use of such techniques shows that his time spent working on stage plays and spectacles was far from wasted. There's also a clever trick with light in the painting. The light in the scene appears to come from the high window on the left wall of the actual dining hall. The shadows on the right wall in the painting and under the table legs are all consistent, with this real window being the light source. The Last Supper is innovative in terms of artistic composition and entirely groundbreaking in terms of the techniques used. Considering all of this, it represents a blend of scientific perspective and theatrical mastery, of intellect and imagination, entirely worthy of Leonardo. But alongside all this beauty, there is something that saddens us. Only 20 years after it was completed, the fresco began to flake and peel away. Leonardo hadn't used a technique that would ensure the fresco's permanence, and he hadn't learned this lesson from his master, Verrocchio. Over the years, there were at least 6 major attempts to restore the fresco, but most of them only made things worse. The final restoration, which began in 1978 and lasted 20 years, was the most extensive and focused solely on returning the fresco to its original state. Despite all efforts, this masterpiece of art history continues to deteriorate day by day, and we may one day lose it completely. In the summer of 1499, when the invading troops sent by the new French king Louis XII entered Milan, Leonardo once again set out for Florence. Upon his return in 1500, he found a city that had lost its former energy and joy, and whose government and guild coffers were empty. Between 1500 and 1506, Leonardo mostly lived in Florence, where he stayed comfortably in a church along with his entourage. This period was, in many respects, the most fruitful of his life. During this second Florentine period, Leonardo began work on the now-lost painting Leda and the Swan, as well as on two of his most important panel paintings, Mona Lisa and The Virgin and Child with Saint Anne. As an engineer, he found consulting work for buildings and also served the military goals of Cesare Borgia. In his free time, he buried himself once again in mathematics and anatomical research. Now it's time for one of Leonardo's greatest masterpieces. And this isn't just my opinion. In a 2012 exhibition at the Louvre Museum, this painting was presented as Leonardo da Vinci's greatest masterpiece. Its full name is The Virgin and Child with Saint Anne, but let's simply call it Saint Anne. When Leonardo returned to Florence from Milan in 1500, the monks at the church where he was staying assigned 5 rooms for him and his assistants. The monks had commissioned an altarpiece for a nearby church. Upon learning of this, Leonardo offered to paint it himself gladly. This would become the Saint Anne painting. He completed the central part of the painting in 1503, but he never delivered it to the church. Instead, he carried it with him until the end of his life, making various revisions over the course of more than 10 years. The work combines many elements of Leonardo's artistic genius. A moment turned into a narrative, physical movements aligned with mental states, a magnificent depiction of the dance of light, elegant use of sfumato, and a landscape rendered with his knowledge of geology and color perspective. One of the first things that catches our attention is that the mother, Saint Anne, looks as young as Mary. They almost seem like sisters. However, according to Christian tradition, Anne had already passed childbearing age when Mary was miraculously born. Leonardo's choice to depict Anne as young may symbolize the fact that he himself was raised by 2 young mothers, one of them a stepmother. In the painting, Mary's right arm is extended in an effort to restrain the child Jesus, expressing a protective yet gentle love. However, Jesus is determined to play with the lamb, with one leg wrapped around its neck and his hands holding its head. The lamb symbolizes Jesus' destiny and the passion he would endure during the crucifixion. When we look at the lower part of the painting, we can see how geologically accurate Leonardo's depiction is. He also portrayed the bright, misty layers of the blue sky in a way no painter before him had done. The painting truly has an increasingly branching, intricate structure, yet all these parts work together to serve the unity of the whole. Its grandeur, striking use of color, and dynamic narrative offer an extraordinary visual experience for those who observe it closely. Today, housed in the Louvre Museum, The Virgin and Child with Saint Anne is Leonardo's most complex and layered panel painting. According to many, it stands on par with the Mona Lisa, and in terms of composition and the complexity of motion it contains, it may even surpass it. We know that many of the paintings Leonardo created throughout his life are either lost or subject to debate. Although he wrote everything down in his notebooks, unfortunately, he never compiled a list of his completed or unfinished paintings. We can only trace these works through contracts or the chronicles of the time. Now, let me introduce you to the most famous of Leonardo's lost paintings, or rather, formerly lost, because it is now the most expensive painting ever sold in history. Here it is, known in Latin as Salvator Mundi, in English as Savior of the World, and marketed as the male Mona Lisa. Salvator Mundi's rediscovery sent shockwaves through the art world. Added to the list of original Leonardo works in 2011, this painting depicts Christ holding a crystal orb in his left hand, while making a gesture of blessing with his right. The Salvator Mundi motif was very popular in the early 1500s, especially among Northern European painters. However, Leonardo's version stands out with some unique features. It's a figure that is both calming and unsettling. A mysterious, piercing gaze, thick, flowing curls, and the signature softness of sfumato, Leonardo's hallmark technique. Let me now tell you the story of how this lost painting was found, because the story itself is even more fascinating than the painting. There is probably no other tale quite like this in art history. If we trace it back as far as we can, we find that the painting was first catalogued in the collections of English kings Charles I and Charles II. It later passed to the Duke of Buckingham, and eventually his son sold the painting in 1763. At that point, the trail went cold, until the year 1900. In 1900, a British collector acquired the painting. He had no idea Leonardo might have painted it. When he purchased it, the work was in terrible condition, overpainted, heavily varnished, and unrecognizable. The collector believed it to be by Leonardo's student Boltraffio, but even that attribution was eventually dismissed, and it was catalogued as a copy of a copy painted by a follower of Boltraffio. In other words, by a student of Leonardo's student. Finally, when the collector's heirs put it up for auction in 1958, it didn't even fetch $100. This is where the story gets interesting. The painting was put up for sale again in 2005 and was purchased for just $1,175 by a group of art dealers and collectors. This group considered the possibility that the work may not have been painted by Boltraffio's student, but perhaps by Boltraffio himself. Even that would make the painting quite valuable. Even could it have been painted by Leonardo da Vinci himself? It was a very slim chance, but one worth exploring. So, the group launched a conservation effort on the severely damaged painting. During the restoration, Diane Modestini discovered signs that suggested the work might actually have been done by Leonardo himself. She cleaned the painting and even repainted the damaged areas. Just imagine, it's the year 2005, and you're telling the world, I have a newly discovered painting by Leonardo da Vinci. Of course, even today, plenty of fraudsters make such claims. So, to prove it, the group needed extremely solid evidence. To find that evidence, the painting was brought to the National Gallery in London in 2008. It was examined by many scholars and experts. Comparisons were made with other works by Leonardo. Its history was investigated, and records of who had owned it were reviewed. But no definitive conclusion could be reached, because numerous copies of the same painting had been made by Leonardo's followers. In the end, the painting was brought to the Louvre Museum in Paris, where a state-of-the-art laboratory designed for art analysis began what may have been the most thorough technical examination in the history of art. Every square millimeter of the painting was meticulously examined, like a Sherlock Holmes-style investigation. Once the painting was cleaned, high-resolution photography and X-ray analysis revealed that Jesus's right thumb had initially been positioned differently, and that a new layer of paint had been added to correct it. This was not the kind of correction a copyist would typically make. Infrared light projected onto the white ground layer of the panel revealed that the painter had pressed his palm onto the wet paint just above Jesus's left eye to achieve the blurred sfumato effect. This was a highly distinctive Leonardo technique. In fact, fingerprint samples from Leonardo's other works were even compared. The piece, like other authenticated Leonardos from the period, was painted on walnut wood using numerous thin, almost translucent layers of paint. At this point, many experts agreed that the work was indeed an original Leonardo. As a result, in 2013, the group managed to sell the painting to a Swiss art dealer for $80 million. That dealer then sold it just 2 days later to a Russian businessman for $127 million. But the story didn't end there. The painting was exhibited in Hong Kong, London, San Francisco, and New York in 2017, and then put up for auction at Christie's in New York on November 15, 2017. A new marketing strategy was used for the piece, promoting it with names like the Male Mona Lisa and the Last Leonardo. This is your last chance to own a work by the greatest artist of Western civilization. The tactic worked, and the painting sold for a staggering $450 million, the highest price ever paid for a work of art at the time. Sometime later, the mysterious buyer was revealed to be Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. But even after that enormous sum was paid, the debates didn't end. There are still lingering doubts about whether the painting is truly an original Leonardo. Now, let's take a closer look at the painting. Unlike other renditions of the same subject, Leonardo's version of Salvator Mundi draws the viewer into shifting emotional interactions. The hazy aura, especially the soft sfumato lines around the lips, creates a psychological mystery and a vague smile that seems to subtly change every time you look at it. You can't quite tell whether Jesus is gazing at you or off into the distance. Leonardo understood that a painting could create an illusion of three-dimensional depth by sharply defining objects in the foreground. Here, he used that to brilliant effect. Jesus' right hand, particularly the two fingers closest to us, has sharper contours. This technique makes the hand appear to project outward, as if moving toward the viewer in the act of blessing. The only flaw in the painting lies in the crystal orb held in Jesus' left hand. Normally, we would expect to see some distortion of the robe behind the orb. Given how immersed Leonardo was in the study of optics, it's nearly impossible that he wouldn't have known this. Perhaps he chose not to depict the distortion, thinking it would distract from the overall effect. Salvator Mundi was painted and reinterpreted by many artists over the centuries. But one version resurfaced 500 years after it was created and became a rare gem of Christian iconography, leaving a profound mark on art history with its remarkable story. In May 1501, Florence was on the verge of a turning point. The city was about to be attacked by Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, notorious for his cruelty. But an agreement was reached, and Florence became a tributary state. As part of the deal, Borgia gained the privilege of employing Florence's most famous artist and engineer, Leonardo da Vinci. In August 1502, Borgia issued an elaborately worded passport for Leonardo. According to this document, Leonardo was tasked with inspecting all the fortresses and fortifications under Borgia's control. He was granted access to any location, full exemption from taxes for himself and his entourage, all necessary assistance, as many men as he required, and authority over all engineers within Borgia's territories. Leonardo set to work. At long last, he had the opportunity to put into practice the military engineering ideas he had been dreaming of for 2 decades. One of his first proposals was that fortress walls should be curved, so cannonballs would strike at an angle and lose force. This became one of his most significant contributions to military engineering. In the city of Cesenatico, he created harbor designs and drew up defense plans for the canal system. He also ordered the harbor floor to be cleared and constructed bridges to help Borgia's army cross rivers. While in the city of Imola, Leonardo made perhaps his greatest contribution to the art of war. He created a map of Imola using a magnetic compass and an odometer of his own design. But this was no ordinary map. It was innovative in style, militarily useful, and aesthetically refined. It combined art and science in a way only Leonardo could. The maps Leonardo created during that period were of immense value to Borgia, whose victories often came through swift campaigns. Leonardo's precise, detailed, and easily readable maps were like a new kind of weapon. In 1503, Leonardo left Borgia's service, as he was deeply affected by seeing how the weapons he helped create had turned into nightmares for others. After his father's death, Leonardo returned to Milan, partly to avoid living in the same city as his half-brothers, and partly to steer clear of competing with a rising star named Michelangelo. In Milan, he adopted a boy named Francesco Melzi. Francesco was the son of a prominent nobleman, a promising and talented young man. A formal agreement was made with his father's permission, and Leonardo adopted him. From today's perspective, this decision might seem unusual, but for the Melzi family, it was a chance for their son to become the student, heir, and secretary of the most creative artist of the time. Thus, Melzi became Leonardo's lifelong companion, alongside Salai, who had joined him years earlier. By the end of 1508, Leonardo was settled in Milan, with housing provided by a local church and a regular stipend from the king. His heart and home were now firmly rooted in Milan. Here, from 1508 to 1513, Leonardo conducted the second phase of his anatomical studies. He had originally begun these scientific pursuits to serve his art, but soon continued purely out of curiosity. During this period, immersed in intense anatomical research, he created 240 drawings and wrote over 13,000 words. In these illustrations, he visualized and explained all the bones, muscle groups, and major organs of the human body. Had he published them, it might have been his greatest scientific achievement. But Leonardo was more interested in the pursuit of knowledge than in spreading it. Some of his discoveries would not be rediscovered until centuries after his time. The most striking of these studies was Leonardo's examination of the body of a man who had died at the age of 100, having never been ill in his entire life. Just hours before his death, the elderly man had told Leonardo that he was over 100 years old, and, apart from weakness, he felt no ailment in his body. In the end, he had truly passed away without showing any signs of illness. Leonardo's passionate curiosity was ignited before the man's body had even cooled. What could be the cause of such a gentle death? He had to uncover the man's anatomy, but how would he do it? Fortunately, during Leonardo's lifetime, the Church had begun to ease its strict ban on dissection. Leonardo kept 30 pages of records related to this dissection. He illustrated both the body and the instruments he used. He was as skilled with a scalpel as he was with a brush. His strong stomach, exceptional drawing abilities, and knowledge of perspective set him apart from other geniuses. The combination of his sharp observational skills and powerful visual memory enabled him to produce drawings that far surpassed those of his predecessors. The results he achieved were a major accomplishment, both scientifically and artistically. With his simple dissection tools, Leonardo meticulously separated untreated corpses layer by layer, even as they began to decay. He first depicted the surface muscles of the elderly man, then removed the skin to illustrate the underlying muscles and veins. He began with the right arm and neck, then moved on to the torso. He described the curved spine structure, then addressed the abdominal wall, intestines, stomach, liver, and the membranes connecting all these parts. After several days, the body became too decomposed to continue the process, so he was never able to study the legs. However, he would probably go on to perform more than 20 additional dissections. By the time he completed his anatomical studies, he had beautifully illustrated every single part and organ of the human body. One particular page, where he perfectly depicted the human spine from different angles and provided detailed annotations, was a masterpiece in both anatomical science and artistic achievement. Among all the dissections he performed, Leonardo's most astonishing work was on the heart. He was one of the first people to truly grasp that the center of the circulatory system was not the liver, as traditionally believed, but the heart. In his notebook, he wrote, "All arteries and veins stem from the heart." He discovered that the heart was not made of some spiritual or special substance, but rather a kind of muscle. He found that it consisted of 4 chambers, not 2, that the upper and lower chambers opened at different times, and that there were valves separating them. He even went so far as to unravel the mechanism of the aortic valve. His prediction about the vortices created by systolic flow was confirmed 450 years later at Oxford University. That's the kind of incredible man Leonardo was. His anatomical studies reached their peak with drawings depicting the beginning of life. He sketched an image of a fetus in the womb on a page filled with tangled notes. His representations of the uterine artery, the vaginal circulatory system, and the blood vessels in the umbilical cord were groundbreaking. In most of his studies, he developed his theories through analogies. Let me give you just one example from his notebook to better illustrate what I mean. Side by side with a sprouting seed, he drew the heart and arteries. He compared the heart to a seed and wrote, "That which creates the tree of the vessels is the seed, placed in the position of the heart." As if all that weren't enough, Leonardo also made a wide range of geological observations. His ability to observe and interpret nature showed that, in some respects, he was 200 years ahead of his time. For example, he noticed that the rock layers on one side of a valley had sedimented in the same sequence as those on the opposite side. He made remarkable discoveries on topics ranging from erosion caused by rivers to the formation of valleys. These observations led Leonardo to think deeply about how marine fossils ended up in high rock layers. In his notebook, he asked, "Why are the bones of large fish, oysters, corals, various other shellfish, and sea snails found on mountain peaks?" He wrote over 3,500 words on this topic, detailing his observations on fossils, and arguing that the biblical story of the flood was incorrect. He wasn't afraid to completely defy religious and traditional beliefs. Leonardo also identified that enormous shifts and undulations had occurred in the Earth's crust, leading to the rise of mountains. This was a groundbreaking observation. In fact, he went so far that among his findings was what we now call a trace fossil. A trace fossil doesn't come from the remains of animals themselves, but from the impressions they left behind, such as footprints, in sediment while they were still alive. In other words, we could say that Leonardo was also one of the pioneers of ichnology, the science of studying fossilized traces, a field that wouldn't formally emerge for another 300 years. Let's now take a look at Leonardo's work in astronomy. One sentence in his notebooks stands out: "The sun does not move." As you know, at that time, it was widely believed that the Earth was stationary and that everything, including the sun, revolved around it. But Leonardo grasped that the Earth was just one of many cosmic bodies and not in a central position. The Earth is neither at the center of the sun's orbit nor at the center of the universe. It is at the center of the elements that accompany it and is connected to them, he wrote. Even more impressive is his understanding that the moon does not emit its own light, but reflects sunlight, and that someone standing on the moon would see Earth reflecting light similarly. He also wrote that the faint glow on the dark part of the moon is caused by weak light reflected from Earth. However, he made an incorrect assumption about the stars, believing they, too, did not emit their own light, but merely reflected the sun's light. That, of course, was mistaken. Leonardo was the kind of person who sought answers even to simple questions that many people wouldn't think to ask. For example, why is the sky blue? He proposed several explanations, and at its core, his answer was correct. The air gets its blue color from particles of moisture that catch the sun's luminous rays. If you climb to the summit of a high mountain, the atmosphere between you and the outer darkness is thinner, so the sky above you will appear proportionally darker. The higher you climb, the more pronounced this effect becomes, eventually reaching pitch black. As always, he never developed these notes into a formal book. Who knows what else was going on inside that mind? In September 1513, Leonardo set out from Milan to Rome to enter the patronage of his new benefactors, Pope Leo X and his brother Giuliano, sons of the magnificent Lorenzo de' Medici. At the time, Melzi was 22 years old, and Salai was 33. Leonardo brought with him 230 kilograms of personal belongings, including over 100 books, countless notebooks, anatomical drawings, scientific instruments, art supplies, clothing, and household items. Most importantly, among these were 5 or 6 paintings that he was still obsessively refining and perfecting. At this point, Leonardo remained more interested in science and engineering than painting. His greatest fascination was with mirrors. Throughout his career, he had made nearly 200 drawings on methods for focusing and directing light. He studied the Arab mathematician Ibn al-Haytham and sought ways to observe the moon more clearly. But his primary interest was in using mirrors to concentrate sunlight and generate heat. He believed mirrors could be used as a weapon. He also thought they could be used for soldering metals and heating enormous cauldrons. During the years between 1506 and 1516, when Leonardo traveled back and forth between Milan and Rome in pursuit of his passions, he produced his masterpieces. We've already examined the St. Anne painting. Now it's time for St. John the Baptist. From the sketches in his notebooks, we know that Leonardo began working on the portrait of St. John the Baptist in 1509 while he was still in Milan. But like many of his later works, he carried this painting with him as he traveled, occasionally sitting down to continue it. He focused on the saint's eyes, mouth, and hand gestures. Emerging from the darkness, this close-up portrait confronts us with all its intensity. There is no distracting landscape or lighting. Only Leonardo's signature curls serve as adornment. While John points upward with his finger in a gesture of divine acceptance and affirmation, he also points toward the source of light that illuminates him. In doing so, he fulfills the role assigned to him in the Bible, to bear witness to the light. Leonardo's use of the chiaroscuro technique, placing striking highlights alongside deep shadows, enhances the sense of mystery in the scene. It also powerfully reinforces John's role as the witness to the true light. On his lips rests the mysterious smile that had become Leonardo's signature. The smile evokes both sensuality and seduction, as well as spirituality. Together with John's androgynous appearance, it adds an erotic tension to the painting. His shoulders and jaw are broad, yet feminine. The model for this painting may have been Salai, known for his delicate face and curly hair. Leonardo never painted hastily enough to make mistakes. This deliberate pace in St. John the Baptist made his sfumato even more refined. The contours are soft, the lines are hazy, and the transitions between light and shadow are masterfully subtle. Only John's hand is depicted with sharpness and clarity, much like in Salvator Mundi. Leonardo knew very well that such emphasis would make an object appear closer, almost as if it belonged to a different plane. Now, we come to the Mona Lisa, the most famous painting in history. Leonardo began the painting in 1503, after leaving the service of Cesare Borgia. From then on, he carried it with him almost his entire life, continuously working on it. In fact, during the final stage of his life, he brought it with him to France and kept adding gentle brush strokes and delicate layers throughout the year, 1517. When he died, the painting was still in his studio. Lisa del Giocondo. This is the real name of the woman you see in this portrait. The subject of the most famous and valuable painting in history, she was born in 1479 into a lesser branch of the distinguished Gherardini family, which had been landowners since feudal times. At 15, she married into the family of silk merchant Francesco Giocondo. When she was 24 and the mother of 2 children, Francesco commissioned a portrait of her from Leonardo. Why Leonardo accepted this commission remains unknown. At the time, he was receiving requests from much more prominent figures. Moreover, he was deeply immersed in his scientific pursuits. The reason may have been family ties and friendships established by Leonardo's father. But more importantly, Lisa was an ordinary, relatively unknown person. That meant Leonardo could paint her as he pleased, in her natural state, without dealing with ridiculous demands and whims. Now, let's go back 40 years and compare young Leonardo's Ginevra da Vinci with the older Leonardo's Mona Lisa. What differences do you notice? What sets apprentice Leonardo apart from master Leonardo? Both women are young wives of Florentine textile merchants. Both are painted in three-quarter profile, set against a river landscape. The first thing that stands out is the significant improvement in Leonardo's technical skills. But more importantly, we see how he matured as a scientist, a philosopher, and a humanist. Leonardo did not paint the portrait as just another commissioned work. He painted it as a universal masterpiece for himself and for future generations. He never delivered the painting, and according to banking records, he never accepted any payment for it. He continued to perfect and retouch the portrait until the end of his life, applying countless thin layers of oil paint over the years. However, after his death, the Mona Lisa inevitably suffered deterioration over the centuries. Today, simply removing most of the varnish without touching the paint itself could bring Mona Lisa closer to its original brilliance. But the painting has become such a powerful cultural icon in its current, varnished state that even the slightest cleaning would spark immense controversy. According to some authorities, performing any restoration on the Mona Lisa would be considered sacrilege. Still, to imagine what a possible conservation might reveal, we can turn to copies made by Leonardo's students. For example, the Prado copy, which was cleaned and restored in 2012, gives us an idea of what the original might have looked like before the varnish was yellowed and cracked. If it were cleaned, the transparency and fluidity of Mona Lisa's silk scarf would likely appear far more delicate and refined. When we examine the painting up close, we see Lisa seated on a terrace, the bases of its columns barely visible at the edges. It's as if we've just stepped out onto the terrace and caught her attention. She looks at us as though she's just noticed our presence. Her hands are gently folded in front of her, resting on the arms of her chair. Her body, especially her hands, appears unusually close to us, while the rugged mountain landscape behind her is misty and far away. One of the details that puzzles many viewers is Lisa's lack of eyebrows. Leonardo was known for meticulously painting even the finest strands of hair, so the eyebrows may have been accidentally removed during one of the painting's early cleanings. High-resolution scans conducted in 2007 seem to support this explanation. Though she wears no luxurious attire, Lisa's modest clothing is rendered with striking precision and scientific accuracy. We can see how her dress gently bulges and how the light catches the vertical folds and pleats. But what stands out most are the mustard copper-colored sleeves, shimmering and rippling with a silky glow. If Leonardo's master Verrocchio had seen them, he would likely have been astonished. Another beautiful detail is the front of Lisa's dress. It begins with 2 rows of interwoven spirals, one of Leonardo's favorite natural patterns. Between the spirals are interlinked golden rings that catch the light as if they were part of a 3-dimensional relief. Just below are the loops he loved to draw, each forming crosses separated by 2 hexagonal twists. Lisa's hair is covered with a delicate veil, a sign of her modesty. The veil is so sheer that, were it not for the faint line it creates at the top of her forehead, we might not notice it descending over her brow at all. If you look closely at how the veil gently cascades down the right side of her hair, you'll notice something remarkable. Leonardo painted the background landscape first, then layered the veil over it using nearly transparent coats of oil paint. Such precision is astonishing. The background landscape is yet another masterful touch. It fades gradually into paler, more indistinct forms. Though the rugged, barren terrain evokes a prehistoric world, the setting is subtly tied to the present by a barely visible arched bridge crossing a river right above Lisa's left shoulder. I want to draw attention to an important point here. Leonardo tried to establish a connection between human nature and the universe we inhabit. It wouldn't be wrong to say that the inner world of Mona Lisa blends with the soul of nature. When you look at her from different angles, you'll see that she seems to come alive. The landscape does not merely serve as a backdrop for Lisa. There's an analogy at play here. It flows toward her and almost becomes part of her. As in many of Leonardo's works, the landforms and misty mountains are a fusion of science and fantasy. For example, the river flowing under the bridge merges with the silk scarf draping from Lisa's left shoulder and begins to twist and curl delicately like a waterfall. The path on the left side leads directly to Lisa's heart. In addition, the front of her dress flows downward like a waterfall. The similar patterns seen both in the background and on Lisa's gown create yet another analogy. They depict the unity of nature and humanity, the flow from the cosmic to the human. Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa in such a way that, like La Belle Ferronnière, her gaze follows you when you move. His mastery of shadows and light made this phenomenon even more prominent in the Mona Lisa. When you stand in front of the painting, you'll see Lisa looking directly at you. As you move side to side, her eyes still seem to follow you. This effect has become so strongly associated with the Mona Lisa that today it's referred to as the Mona Lisa effect. Leonardo was a master at expressing the manifestations of emotion. In this regard, the Mona Lisa's subtle smile is a mystery of its own. It is a product of Leonardo's anatomical studies. He also used his knowledge of optics to create an elusive smile. Now, I want you to focus on her lips. She doesn't seem to be smiling much, does she? But as your attention shifts to her eyes, her cheeks, or any other part of the painting, you'll notice Lisa beginning to smile. One moment, she appears lively, cheerful, and radiant. Then the next, detached and still. Isn't that marvelous? The face of the Mona Lisa is truly the most recognizable in the world, and it seems unlikely to fade from memory anytime soon. Events like its theft in 1911 and repeated attempts to damage it have only enhanced its fame and deepened the emotional connection people feel with it. Thanks to that, it draws 6 million visitors to the Louvre Museum every year. What's most miraculous is that Lisa, though merely a painting, appears to be aware, not just of us, but of herself. This is a painting created in such a way that it could make even the most confident painters tremble. It has transcended the identity of a specific person's portrait to become a universal icon, a manifestation of our inner lives. It was Leonardo's deepest reflection on what it means to be human. Toward the end of his life, Leonardo went to France and came under the patronage of King Francis I. A train of mules carried his belongings, chests of clothes, personal effects, manuscripts, and at least 3 paintings he continued to obsessively refine: Saint Anne, Saint John the Baptist, and the Mona Lisa. Francis was a refined and noble man, deeply hungry for knowledge. He valued science and art and aimed to bring the Renaissance, then sweeping through Italy, into France. And to a large extent, he succeeded. He spent his nights attending performances and shows arranged for him. Leonardo was the perfect fit to serve at his court. Francis truly loved Leonardo, admired him, and was enchanted by his knowledge. He granted Leonardo a peaceful and spacious manor, provided him with a regular income, and awarded him the title of first painter, engineer, and architect to the king. In fact, the king enjoyed his company so much that he spent very few days of the year apart from him. Leonardo, in turn, greatly appreciated this attention, often hosting guests at his residence and showing them his artworks. Just as a well-spent day brings happy sleep, a well-spent life brings a happy death, Leonardo once wrote in his notebook. Death came for him on May 2, 1519, just 3 weeks after his 67th birthday. One of his early biographers, Giorgio Vasari, describes Leonardo's final moments like this. King François, who had made it a habit to visit Leonardo with affection, entered the room just as the priest, having administered the final prayers, was leaving. Leonardo gathered all his strength and sat up in bed to describe his illness and its symptoms. A violent fit suddenly seized him, a sure sign that death was near. The king rose to his feet and cradled Leonardo's head in his arms, hoping to ease his pain. Fully aware that his divine soul could not depart in greater honor, Leonardo drew his last breath in the arms of the king. This powerful moment would later be painted by many artists devoted to Leonardo, giving us a final scene as fitting and beautiful as the life that preceded it. In a warm and peaceful home, surrounded by the paintings he cherished most, Leonardo died strong, honored, and held by a patron who revered him. Today, his grave lies in the chapel of Saint-Hubert in Amboise, France. And we've come to the conclusion of the video. A horse model buried in the dusty pages of history, countless unfinished paintings, machines that never flew, tanks that never moved, and pages upon pages of unpublished, brilliant investigations. Some of these were left unrealized due to Leonardo's personality, and others simply because his genius wasn't recognized in his time. Undoubtedly, the works he completed are enough to prove his brilliance. Beyond all his artistic masterpieces and anatomical sketches, even just the Mona Lisa or the Last Supper alone would suffice. He was a true genius, one of the very few in history who truly deserved to be called so. But remember, his talents weren't some magical gift bestowed upon him. He honed them through tireless effort. That said, he wasn't without flaws. He was a perfectionist to a fault. He didn't live by the philosophy that perfect is the enemy of good. There's a sentence that appears repeatedly in his notebooks, a line that sums up his philosophy. Art is never finished, only abandoned. In truth, Leonardo cared more about the journey than the destination, because there was always something new to learn. There was always one more brushstroke that could bring a painting closer to perfection, drawn from knowledge gathered from nature. Art and science are both vital to the development of an individual or a society. Engaging with art matters because it expands one's vision and fuels imagination. A person who sculpts, paints, or composes music becomes more creative, and that creativity can eventually lead you to invent things or unlock the secrets of nature, just like Leonardo did. Can a society like that ever fall behind? Once you immerse yourself in Leonardo's world, you might begin to notice things you never paid attention to before. The light filtering through a curtain, the way distant trees create perspective against those nearby, how birds stay aloft, or why stars sparkle. You may never design a tank, invent a new method of cartography, or create the Mona Lisa, but you can learn something far more valuable from Leonardo. Approaching the world around you and the everyday phenomena you encounter with passionate curiosity will enrich every moment of your life.